and the walls had finally broken. Not through strategy, but through the sheer weight of desperate men climbing ladders in the dark while defenders poured boiling oil down the stones. A woman named Yasmin was in the cellar beneath her home. She was 31 years old. Her husband, a cloth merchant, had been killed on the walls 3 days earlier. She crouched in the darkness with her 2 daughters, 9 and 6, pressed against her body beneath the floorboards of the only home they had ever known. Above her, the city was dying. First the clash of metal that meant fighting in the streets, then screaming as the violence moved beyond soldiers and into homes. Then the crashing of doors broken open, repeating at intervals as soldiers moved house to house. Then silence from each home after the door was breached. Each silence was a family. Each silence was an ending. The Crusaders who poured through Ma'ara's walls had been marching for 3 years. They had walked from France and Norman Italy across a continent, through disease that killed more of them than any army, through a hunger so severe their bodies had been consuming themselves for months. They had besieged Antioch for 8 months and nearly starved outside its walls. What remained was something that suffering and religious fervor had forged into a weapon without a safety mechanism. These men believed that God had sent them to reclaim the Holy Land, that every enemy killed was an enemy of Christ, that everything they did inside conquered cities was sanctioned by divine authority. The massacre at Ma'ara killed an estimated 20,000 people. The city had no military garrison. It was a market town. Its people were merchants, craftspeople, farmers who had sheltered behind the walls when the Frankish army appeared. They were civilians in every sense. What happened after the killing was so extreme that even the Crusader chroniclers could not suppress it. Fulcher of Chartres, a priest who celebrated every victory as God's favor, recorded that soldiers consumed the flesh of the dead. Radolf of Caen confirmed it. Albert of Aachen added detail. The cannibalism at Ma'ara is documented by multiple independent sources because too many witnesses saw it. But the chroniclers who could not avoid mentioning the eating of the dead found it easy to avoid mentioning what happened to the living, the women of Ma'ara, what was done to them before and during the massacre. These details appear in the Arab sources with a precision that suggests the historians who recorded them understood they were preserving something the other side would erase. They were right. For 900 years, the Western version told Ma'ara as a regrettable excess by starving men. It did not tell the story of the women in the cellars. That story was written. It was simply never translated into languages that Western schoolchildren were taught to read. You have heard of the Crusades. You learned about them in school. Knights in armor riding toward Jerusalem under the banner of the cross. Richard the Lionheart facing Saladin across the desert. A clash of civilizations fought between armies on battlefields in the Holy Land. That is the version. It is not false. It is incomplete in a way that amounts to the same thing. The Crusades were not fought between armies on open fields. They were fought through cities, through streets filled with civilians who had nowhere to go when the walls were breached. The primary victims of every Crusader siege, every sack, every conquest were not soldiers. They were the people who lived behind the walls. Women, children, the elderly, merchants and craftspeople whose only connection to the military conflict was the misfortune of living in a city that someone with an army wanted to take. Western chronicles celebrated the military victories. Arab chronicles documented what happened to the people left behind. For 900 years, Western historians drew primarily from Western sources and produced a version of the Crusades that omitted what those sources omitted. The Arab accounts were available. Manuscripts preserved in libraries across the Islamic world. They were not consulted, not translated, not taught. The result was a 900-year gap in the historical record, not because the evidence was missing, but because no one with the authority to shape Western education considered the evidence relevant. If you want to understand what actually happened to women during 2 centuries of holy war, what happened in the hours after the walls fell, the period that Crusader chroniclers skipped and Arab historians recorded in devastating detail, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to reveal comes from both sides of the conflict, from Latin chronicles and Arabic manuscripts, from the words of priests who marched with the army, and the words of historians who buried the dead after the army left. This is the Crusades, as they were experienced by the people history forgot to ask. Stay until the end, because the fragments of women's voices that survive from this era, hidden in court records and poetry and the margins of manuscripts, have waited 9 centuries to be heard. To understand what happened to women during the Crusades, you need to understand what kind of army arrived at the walls of their cities. It was not a professional military force. It was not an organized campaign staffed by trained soldiers operating under a chain of command with rules of engagement. It was something the medieval world had never produced before and would never produce again. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont in central France and called upon Christendom to march east and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. The speech itself does not survive in a reliable version, but its effects are documented beyond dispute. Urban offered something that no pope had offered before: complete absolution of sins for anyone who took the cross. Every crime you had committed, every sin that weighed on your soul, every punishment that awaited you in the afterlife, wiped clean, erased. All you had to do was march to Jerusalem and fight for God. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands answered. Knights and nobles, yes, but they were the minority. The majority were peasants, farmers with no land, debtors fleeing obligations, younger sons who would inherit nothing, criminals who saw the cross as a pardon, men with nothing to lose and everything to gain from a journey that promised spiritual salvation and material reward simultaneously. They brought their families. They brought their hatreds. They brought the accumulated frustrations of lives lived at the bottom of a feudal system that offered them no future, and they channeled all of it into a religious mission that told them God wanted them to kill. The journey east took 3 years, and it destroyed them, not militarily, psychologically. The army crossed the Byzantine Empire, fought Turkish forces at Dorylaeum, and then entered a landscape of heat and scarcity that European peasants were completely unprepared for. Disease killed them in waves. Dysentery, typhoid, infections from wounds that festered in the heat, starvation thinned them further. Supply lines that had never been adequate collapsed entirely during the 8-month siege of Antioch, where the Crusaders ate their horses, then their leather equipment, then whatever they could find in the surrounding countryside, until the countryside had nothing left to give. By the time the army moved south from Antioch toward Jerusalem, the men who remained were not the men who had left Europe. They had been transformed by 3 years of suffering into something that operated on desperation and faith in equal measure. They believed God was testing them. They believed their suffering was purification. They believed that the cities ahead of them contained not just enemies, but enemies of God, and that whatever they did to those enemies was not just permitted, but righteous. The religious framework that had motivated the crusade did not restrain the violence. It authorized it. A soldier who killed in God's name was performing an act of worship. A soldier who took plunder from a conquered city was accepting God's reward. And a soldier who seized a woman from a conquered population was claiming property that God had given him through victory. This was the army that arrived at the gates of Antioch, of Ma'ara, of Jerusalem, starving, brutalized, absolutely certain that divine authority sanctioned everything they were about to do. And the people behind those gates, the women and children and elderly who had no army to protect them, and no walls strong enough to keep out men who had walked 3 years to reach them, had no idea what was coming. Antioch fell in June of 1098, and it established the pattern that would repeat at every major Crusader conquest for the next 2 centuries. The city had held out for 8 months. The Crusaders had nearly died outside its walls. When a traitor opened a gate in the night and the army poured through, the violence that followed carried the accumulated fury of those 8 months of starvation and disease. The military garrison was overwhelmed within hours. What happened next was not a battle, it was a sack. The army moved through the city systematically, district by district, breaking open homes, killing men, looting everything portable. The Gesta Francorum, the primary Latin chronicle of the First Crusade, written by an anonymous Norman knight who was present, describes the fall of Antioch as a glorious victory. God delivered the city into Frankish hands. The enemy was scattered. The narrative moves quickly from the breach to the aftermath, skipping the hours between with the practiced efficiency that characterizes every Western account of every Crusader city sack. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing from the other side, did not skip those hours. He describes the Crusaders entering homes and killing the men they found inside. He describes women dragged into the streets. He describes the separation of women from their families as a deliberate process conducted amid the chaos of the sack, soldiers identifying women and pulling them from groups of civilians the way a buyer at market identifies the goods he wants from a larger inventory. The selection happened in real time. While killing continued in adjacent streets, soldiers paused to evaluate which women to seize and which to leave. Youth was the primary criterion. A young woman was taken, an old woman was not. The distinction was economic rather than merciful. A young woman had value, an old woman did not. The seized women were claimed as personal property by individual soldiers. The distribution followed the hierarchy that governed all Crusader spoils. Knights and nobles claimed first. Men-at-arms and sergeants claimed second. Common soldiers fought over what remained. The women were divided alongside gold, fabrics, horses, and weapons. They appeared in the same inventories. They were discussed in the same transactions. The language of the sources makes no distinction between human plunder and material plunder, because the men conducting the distribution made no such distinction. The women taken at Antioch disappear from the Western chronicles entirely after the city's fall. They are not mentioned in accounts of the army's subsequent march south. They are not